the scarred man, and the German shepherd's instinct. The patrol was supposed to be routine. Snow along the roads, silence in the woods, and nothing more than the hum of an engine. But Daniel Ward had learned long ago, silence in Willow Creek often meant danger. And his partner, Ranger, sensed it first. The shepherd's growl rattled through the SUV, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the tree line. Daniel slowed the car, following Ranger's gaze, until he saw something that made his blood run cold. A child, alone, shivering in the snow, her small hands clutching a ragged piece of paper. He knelt to meet her eyes, but she did not cry. She only whispered, "Please save my mummy." Then she held out the paper. On it was the crude drawing of 3 figures, a woman, a child, and a tall man whose scarred face was scribbled into oblivion. Daniel knew in that moment that this wasn't just a rescue. This was the beginning of something darker, a chase into the woods, into a life torn apart, where a German shepherd's loyalty and a child's courage would lead to a truth the whole town needed to face. The first snow of December had come heavy over Willow Creek, a mountain town tucked against the dark ridges of the northern Rockies. By nightfall, it had transformed the streets into a quiet white labyrinth. Every rooftop softened under a quilt of frost. Every pine bowed with the weight of winter. The town was hushed, as if holding its breath. A few windows still glowed with amber light, families gathering around supper, children pressed to the glass in wonder. But beyond those islands of warmth stretched an endless cold. Officer Daniel Ward knew that cold well. He drove slowly down Timberline Road, his patrol SUV's headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the snow-laden dark. The tires hummed low against the frozen pavement, every curve familiar yet strange under the storm's disguise. The radio crackled faintly, dispatch muttering about icy roads and a fender bender near the highway. But Daniel barely listened. Nights like this, in a town this small, silence was the thing that spoke loudest. Beside him sat Ranger, his German shepherd partner. The dog's body was a steady, reassuring presence, filling the passenger seat with quiet discipline. Ranger sat upright, amber eyes fixed ahead, ears twitching at each faint sound the forest surrendered. He had served years before Daniel ever took the oath, first in military service, then transferred into canine duty. Even now, with scars hidden beneath his thick winter coat, Ranger carried himself like a soldier. Daniel glanced at him from time to time, and it was impossible not to feel the weight of that companionship. The town respected him as an officer, but he often felt more a shadow than a man, someone who once had a life beyond this uniform. Since the accident 3 winters ago, the one that took his wife in a blink of twisted metal, Daniel had carried silence inside him heavier than the snow pressing down on the mountains. He hadn't spoken of it much. People in Willow Creek gave him space, offered casseroles, a pat on the back, a place to sit at Sunday service. But grief was something that sat with you long after everyone else had gone home. In those empty years, it was Ranger who kept him anchored. Nights when he couldn't sleep, the shepherd would nudge his hand, lie close enough that Daniel could feel a heartbeat other than his own. On patrol, when weariness threatened to dull his instincts, Ranger's alertness sharpened them both. Trust like that was wordless, built in glances and gestures, in the quiet certainty that the other would never walk away. Outside, the forest pressed tight to the road. Pines loomed like sentinels, their branches heavy, their shadows deeper than the headlights could reach. The air carried that peculiar metallic tang that came before a heavier snow, the kind that blanketed the world and hid whatever waited beneath. Daniel kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting near the console. The heater blew weakly, unable to banish the chill that seeped into his bones. He found himself remembering his wife's laughter in winters past, the way she'd scold him for not wearing gloves, the smell of her cinnamon tea filling the house. Memory had sharp edges, especially in silence. He caught himself tightening his jaw, forcing the images back into the quiet place where he kept them locked. He couldn't afford to drift tonight. A low sigh escaped him, more breath than sound. Ranger's ears flicked, as though sensing the weight of his thoughts. Daniel reached out, absently brushing his fingers against the shepherd's thick fur. The dog leaned into the touch for a moment, then returned his gaze to the windshield, a sentinel keeping watch. The road curved, dipping near the frozen creek bed that gave Willow Creek its name. No other headlights glowed in either direction. The town was behind them now, the forest closing in. Out here, the silence was sharper, the kind that made every sound, every snap of branch, every crunch of ice, feel amplified. Daniel slowed the SUV. It wasn't that he expected trouble, but years in service, first in the Marines, later in uniform, had taught him that danger often chose nights like this, nights when the world seemed too still, when the cold pressed down so hard it masked the footsteps of those who didn't belong. He scanned the tree line as they rolled past, dark, endless, layered with snow. A storm bruise hung low above the ridges, smudging the horizon into a smear of gray-black. The moon was only a pale coin behind the clouds, offering no comfort. Inside the vehicle, warmth was thin. Frost edged the corners of the windshield despite the heater, delicate webs forming faster than they could melt. Daniel rubbed at them with his gloved hand, exhaling slowly. For a moment, he let himself wonder what normal felt like, what it might mean to live a life without scars. But the thought slipped away as quickly as it came. He had long ago accepted that some men were meant to keep watch, while others slept safe in their beds. And tonight, in the frozen silence of Willow Creek, he felt that truth settle deeper into him. Ranger shifted suddenly, his weight pressing against the seat. The shepherd's body went taut, ears pricking forward. A low vibration rumbled in his chest. Not yet a growl, but the sound of warning forming. Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel, his breath catching in the cold. He glanced at his partner, at the way the dog's eyes had sharpened toward the tree line. Something was out there. The SUV rolled forward another 100 feet before Daniel eased it toward the shoulder, headlights sweeping across the wall of pines. He cut the engine. The sudden silence pressed in heavier than the wind. The ranger did not move. His gaze was locked into the forest, body still as stone. And in that moment, Daniel felt it too, the shift in the air, the subtle wrongness that years of service had taught him never to ignore. The frozen patrol was no longer routine. It was the beginning of something else. The engine ticked faintly as it cooled, the only sound in the hush that followed. Outside, the forest stretched wide and black, pine boughs heavy with snow that sagged under their own silence. The headlights washed pale across the tree line, illuminating no more than the first row of trunks before being swallowed whole. Beyond that, only shadows, layered and endless. And the ranger didn't move. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, but every muscle was drawn taut, coiled as if ready to spring. His ears pointed forward like twin arrows, tail rigid, nose twitching at scents Daniel could never hope to catch. A low sound slipped from his throat then, deep, guttural, carrying with it no hesitation. A growl. Daniel froze. He knew that sound. It wasn't the curious rumble Ranger gave when spotting a deer, or the cautious warning when strangers walked too close. This was different, a sound born of certainty. A predator, recognizing something that did not belong. The chill outside pressed through the SUV's windows, but Daniel felt another kind of cold spread in his chest. He reached down slowly, fingers brushing along the shepherd's back. The fur was bristled, standing in a way it rarely did, thick coat lifted as though static charged. Ranger's body vibrated under his palm, not trembling, but alive with restrained tension. "Easy, boy," Daniel whispered, though the words weren't for calming. They were habit, a tether between them. He trusted Ranger more than his own eyes on nights like this. Daniel cracked the driver's door. The winter air rushed in immediately, sharp as knives. His breath fogged white as he stepped out, boots crunching against the frozen shoulder. He pulled his flashlight free, thumb brushing over the switch, but not yet clicking it on. Too soon for light. Sometimes it was better to let the dark reveal itself. Ranger leapt down beside him, landing silently, despite the weight of muscle and bone. The shepherd's nose lowered, sweeping left to right, drawing invisible lines across the air. Then he stilled, head jerking sharply toward the tree line. The growl deepened, followed by a single, precise bark. Daniel felt it in his ribs, a warning, a declaration. The forest returned nothing in answer. Only the faint groan of snow shifting off branches, the faraway creak of ice settling. But Daniel knew better than to believe silence meant safety. He scanned the tree line. Every trunk looked the same, tall, black, thick with shadow. Yet the stillness carried weight, as if something was hidden just beyond sight, watching. The hair on his neck rose, the old instinct from his service days flaring alive. Afghanistan had taught him that quiet wasn't absence. Quiet was patience. The smell came next. Subtle, carried low on the wind. Not pine, not frost, but smoke. Thin, acrid, faint as though from a dying fire. Daniel tilted his head, drawing in another breath, and felt it scratch his throat. Ranger had already noticed. His nose pressed forward, chest vibrating with that low whine he only used when he wanted Daniel to follow. Daniel adjusted his stance, pulling his jacket tighter. The air felt colder now, though he knew it wasn't the temperature that had shifted. It was the sense that they were no longer alone on this road. He clicked on the flashlight. A narrow beam sliced into the tree line, bouncing off bark, catching flecks of snow. Nothing moved. No footprints marred the white powder along the shoulder. No tracks of deer, fox, or man. And yet, Ranger stepped forward, one paw at a time, weight balanced, body angled low. Daniel followed, boots crunching on the ice-packed ground. Each step sent sound outward like ripples in still water, echoing too loud in the hush. His breath fogged and lingered, caught in the cone of his flashlight. He exhaled slower, quieter, as if even breathing too hard might draw something from the shadows. The forest pressed tighter with each step. The road behind them seemed to fall away, swallowed by dark. Ranger's nose hovered just inches above the snow, tail stiff, eyes locked ahead. His breath plumed in sharp bursts, mist curling back into the cold. Daniel lifted his free hand to rest on the butt of his sidearm. Not drawing, not yet, but I'm ready. His heart ticked harder in his chest, the steady rhythm turning sharp. "Show me," he whispered. Ranger's ears flicked back at the sound, then forward again. His body shifted, pulling Daniel closer to the tree line. For a moment, the flashlight beam caught nothing but white and shadow. Then, something. A flicker, not movement exactly, but a glint, a scrap of fabric, a reflection. It was gone as quickly as it came. Daniel steadied the beam, sweeping back. The trees revealed only themselves, silent and still. The smell of smoke grew stronger. He crouched slightly, narrowing his focus. The sound of his boots settling into snow cracked like thunder in the stillness. He winced, listening harder. That was when the forest answered. Not loud, barely more than a whisper. But Daniel heard it. Something soft, muffled, a shift in air that didn't belong to the wind. His pulse jumped. He aimed the beam lower, sweeping along the brush. Ranger's growl sharpened into a bark, louder this time, commanding. He took 2 steps forward, fur bristling along his spine. Daniel's throat tightened. Every instinct in him shouted that something waited ahead, just beyond where the light could reach. He adjusted his stance, hand brushing the grip of his weapon. The forest remained silent, but the sense of foreboding grew heavier, sinking into his bones. He glanced once at Ranger and saw in the shepherd's eyes not fear, but certainty. Something was wrong in Willow Creek tonight, and they were standing at the edge of it. The silence broke with the faintest sound, so fragile Daniel almost doubted he'd heard it. A crackle of branches, a weight shifting in the brush just beyond the sweep of his flashlight. Ranger froze, nose pointing, body taut as a drawn bow. His bark had narrowed into a low whine now, not warning, but urging. Daniel's heart thudded. He stepped closer, boots crunching against the frost, the beam of his light steady in his grip. The forest opened in slivers, dark trunk, snow-dusted bramble, then a patch of movement where no movement should have been. At first, he thought it a bundle of cloth caught on the underbrush, tossed there by some passing truck. But then it stirred, slowly, haltingly, as if the forest itself had exhaled. The beam caught pale skin, a thin arm wrapped around a frail body. Daniel's breath lodged in his throat. It wasn't fabric. It was a child. She stood half-hidden among the branches, barefoot on the frozen ground, her toes red and raw from the cold. A thin dress clung to her small frame, once pink, but now streaked with dirt and something darker. She wavered unsteadily, knees knocking together, her arms wrapped tight across her chest. Her hair was tangled, her lips blue from the biting air, and in her hand, crumpled and pressed against her heart, was a scrap of paper. Ranger let out a sharp, decisive bark and stepped forward. The girl's head jerked up at the sound. Her eyes, wide, glassy, ringed with exhaustion, locked on Daniel. He crouched instantly, lowering himself, his flashlight angled to the ground so it wouldn't blind her. His voice softened, carrying warmth against the brittle cold. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said quietly, each word measured so it wouldn't frighten her further. "My name's Daniel. I'm with the police. You're safe now, okay?" For a moment she didn't move, only her lips parted, trembling. And then, barely more than a whisper, words spilled into the frozen night. "Shin haiku me chao." Daniel felt those 5 words cut straight through him. Not a cry, not a demand, but a plea so raw it seemed to carry all the weight her small body could not. He swallowed hard, forcing his composure to hold. "We'll help her," he said softly. "I promise. But let's get you warm first." He inched forward slowly, careful not to rush. Ranger moved with him, low to the ground, tail still, ears forward. The shepherd's presence seemed to calm the child more than Daniel's words. She didn't flinch when Ranger drew near, only tightened her grip on the crumpled paper. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Daniel asked, his voice steady, though his chest ached. The girl blinked, slow and deliberate, as if pulling the strength to speak. "Sophie," she whispered. "Sophie Miller." Her knees buckled a little, and Daniel moved quickly, closing the last distance. He slid his arms around her slight frame, lifting her with care. She weighed almost nothing, less than the winter coat slung over his shoulders, yet every ounce of her carried the bruises of something far heavier. As he held her, Sophie's fingers clutched desperately at his collar, anchoring herself as if afraid he might vanish. Daniel's throat tightened. He adjusted his grip, drawing her closer, trying to lend her warmth. Ranger circled once around them, nose to the snow, before falling in at Daniel's side. The shepherd glanced up at the girl with dark, steady eyes, then back to the tree line, ever watchful. Daniel carried her back toward the SUV. The forest seemed to lean in behind them, as if reluctant to release what it had hidden. The night pressed heavier with each step, every sound of their boots echoing louder than before. When they reached the vehicle, Daniel eased the back door open with one hand, cradling Sophie with the other. He set her gently on the seat, pulling off his patrol coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. The coat swallowed her whole, her small face barely peeking out above the collar. Her trembling slowed, though the wide, dazed look in her eyes did not fade. She still clutched the paper in one hand, knuckles white. Daniel crouched at her level, speaking softly. "Can I see what you're holding, Sophie?" She hesitated, then slowly extended it. It was a child's drawing, shaky lines pressed hard into paper. A woman, a little girl, and beside them, a tall figure. The man's face had been scribbled over with thick black strokes, so forceful the paper nearly tore. An X cut across where eyes and mouth should have been. Daniel's stomach tightened. "Is that your mom?" he asked gently. Sophie nodded, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. "She told me to run," she whispered. "When he got mad, she screamed, and I knew it was time." Daniel reached for his radio with one hand, the other still resting lightly on Sophie's shoulder. His voice was clipped but controlled. "Dispatch. This is Officer Ward. I've located a juvenile female, approximate age 5, no shoes, visible bruising, possible hypothermia. I need medical and child services at the station. Copy." Static crackled, then a voice confirmed. Daniel clicked the radio back, turning to Sophie once more. "We're going to take care of you. You're not alone anymore." She looked at him, eyes swimming, then at Ranger, who had climbed into the back seat and settled close enough that she could reach him. Slowly, Sophie's small hand lifted from beneath the coat and pressed against the shepherd's fur. Ranger did not move, only lowered his head slightly, ears flicking in acknowledgement. For the first time that night, Daniel saw a hint of something soften in Sophie's face. Not safety, not yet, but the smallest flicker of trust. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing hard against his chest. The night had begun with silence, but now it carried a plea he could not ignore. A child had asked him to save her mother, and nothing in Daniel Ward's heart would let him walk away from that. The heater coughed to life with a low groan, filling the patrol SUV with the first threads of warmth. Frost still feathered along the inside edges of the windows, but already the air inside was softer than the brittle cold of the forest. Daniel glanced back at the girl curled in his coat, making sure she hadn't slipped into a dangerous stillness. Sophie Miller sat small against the wide bench seat, the patrol coat enveloping her like a cocoon. Only her face peeked out, pale and hollow-cheeked, framed by tangles of hair. Her lips were still bluish, but she was shivering less now, her breaths shallow but steady. Her small fingers gripped the fabric tight, as though afraid it might be taken away. Daniel settled into the driver's seat for a moment, his eyes flicking from the rearview mirror to the girl. He wasn't sure how much she understood yet, that she was safe, that the worst of the night was behind her. But he knew from the hollow way her eyes moved that survival was still the only thought holding her together. Ranger, as if sensing the fragility of the moment, moved closer without waiting for a command. With a slow, deliberate motion, the shepherd curled onto the seat beside her. His big body shifted carefully, not crowding but close enough for warmth. Sophie's eyes flickered at the movement, wide and uncertain at first. Daniel held his breath, watching. But she didn't flinch. In fact, her small hand reached out almost instinctively, pressing against Ranger's fur beneath the coat's edge. The dog didn't move away. He simply lowered his head, resting his chin on the seat so that her hand stayed in place against him. His eyes, dark and steady, lifted to meet hers only for a second, before returning to the quiet watch of the window. Something softened in Sophie then, a faint release in her shoulders, a tremor that wasn't fear this time, but relief. She leaned just slightly into the shepherd's warmth, her cheek brushing the coat, her fingers tangling in the thick fur, as though anchoring herself. Daniel exhaled slowly, realizing only then how tightly his chest had been drawn. He adjusted the heater dial higher, letting the air circulate toward the back seat. His voice came low, gentle. "He's called Ranger," he said. "He's a good one. You can trust him." The girl didn't answer, but her hand stayed where it was, nestled in the shepherd's coat. Ranger let out a slow huff of breath, content. Daniel turned in his seat, resting one arm on the headrest, so she could see his face clearly without him looming. "We're going to take you to the station. Someone there will help you get warm. Maybe a blanket, some hot chocolate. Does that sound okay?" Her eyes flicked to his, hesitant. She gave the smallest of nods. "Good," Daniel murmured. The radio crackled, breaking the stillness. Dispatch confirmed that an ambulance and child services were en route to Willow Creek Station. Daniel acknowledged, his voice clipped, but calm. When he set the receiver back in place, the quiet returned, broken only by the hum of the heater and the faint rustle of Sophie's coat as she shifted closer to Ranger. He watched her for a long moment. Children carried truths in their bodies long before they could voice them. Sophie's bare feet, bruised and raw from the cold, told one story. The way she clutched the drawing even now, the paper crumpled but not released, told another. Daniel's mind churned. Somewhere out there, a woman, her mother, was still in danger. The girl's plea rang fresh in his ears. "Shin haiku me chao." He closed his eyes briefly, forcing himself to steady his breathing. There would be time to act. But right now, the child in his back seat needed to believe she was safe. Ranger seemed to know this without being told. The shepherd shifted again, curling so that Sophie was bracketed between him and the door, as though forming a shield. His ears flicked at every sound outside, every creak of snow on the roof, but he never moved away from her. Daniel found himself remembering his wife, how she used to kneel down to children in the community, her voice always softer when speaking to them. She had a way of making them feel seen. He wondered, not for the first time, if he was capable of the same. Grief had made him hard in places where he once had been tender. But tonight, with a child trembling in his back seat, he felt that old tenderness stir. He shifted slightly, his tone dropping to the same calm cadence he used with Ranger after a rough call. "You did good, Sophie. Really good. You were brave to make it out here. You're safe now." Her hand tightened in Ranger's fur, but she didn't look away this time. Her eyes, though clouded with fear, held his for a moment. Then she whispered, voice raspy, "Don't let him find me." Daniel's throat tightened. He forced his reply steady, absolute. "He won't. Not while you're with me." Ranger lifted his head then, as if to punctuate the promise. The shepherd's eyes burned steady in the dim light, a wordless vow that carried more weight than any uniform or badge. Sophie's lips trembled, but she pressed closer into the shepherd's side, half hidden in fur and fabric. Her small body seemed to finally surrender to the warmth. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy, though her grip on the drawing never loosened. Daniel watched her begin to drift, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, the sense of urgency thrumming louder beneath his calm exterior. There was still a mother out there, waiting. Still a scared man who thought no one would come. But tonight, a child survived the forest, and she had found her way into his patrol car, into Ranger's protection. That was where the fight would begin. He turned the key, the SUV's engine humming back to life. The headlights pushed forward again, cutting the darkness in two. The road to Willow Creek stretched ahead, lonely and white under the falling snow. In the rear view, Daniel caught one last glance. Sophie's small hand tangled in Ranger's coat, her fragile body cocooned in warmth she had nearly lost to the night. The bond had already begun, and Daniel knew with a certainty he hadn't felt in years that this night was only the beginning of something larger than any patrol. The road back toward Willow Creek unfurled like a ribbon of pale gray, winding through the pines. Snow tapped lightly against the windshield, flakes tumbling out of the darkness and scattering in the beams of the headlights. Inside the patrol SUV, warmth had settled into the cabin, but the atmosphere was far from calm. Daniel's hands stayed firm on the steering wheel, his eyes shifting between the road ahead and the rear-view mirror. In the back seat, Sophie sat curled into his coat, her tiny frame swallowed by it. Her head rested lightly against the window, though her eyes were far from sleep. They were wide, restless, darting between Ranger and the crumpled piece of paper still clutched tightly in her hand. The paper, creased, smudged, clutched as though it were the last thing tethering her to safety. Daniel noticed the way her fingers trembled each time she shifted it, as though the thought of letting go filled her with dread. He caught her gaze in the mirror. "Sophie," he said gently, his voice carrying over the low hum of the heater. "Can I see what you've been holding?" Her small shoulders stiffened, her eyes dropping quickly to the paper. Silence stretched, heavy and fragile. Ranger lifted his head from where he'd been lying, his ears pricking at the shift in her breathing. The shepherd's gaze lingered on Sophie, calm but intent, as though waiting for her answer too. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, with a slow, reluctant motion, Sophie extended her hand. The paper unfurled just slightly, edges frayed, one corner nearly torn through from being gripped so hard. Daniel reached back, taking it with careful fingers, as though it might disintegrate if he handled it too roughly. He laid it on his lap, the dim glow from the dashboard lighting it just enough to see. It was a drawing, childlike, uneven lines pressed deep into the page with a heavy hand. A little girl with a round head of hair. A taller figure beside her, a woman drawn with long lines of hair and wide arms reaching out. And next to them, larger, looming, another figure. The third figure's face was gone. Where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only darkness. Harsh black scribbles covered every feature, layer upon layer, until the paper had nearly torn through. Thick lines crossed violently, an angry X gouged over it. Daniel stared at it, a heaviness growing in his chest. He didn't need training manuals to tell him what this meant. He'd seen it in other children before, those forced to put fear into images because words were too heavy to carry. This was how Sophie had made sense of what she couldn't say aloud. His throat tightened. He looked back at her, his voice low. "This is your mom?" He pointed gently to the figure with long hair. Sophie's head bobbed in a tiny nod. "And this little one? That's you?" Another nod, her lips pressing into a thin line. Daniel hesitated before pointing to the blackened figure. "And him?" Sophie's breath hitched. She drew her knees up closer to her chest, hugging them under the coat. "He—" Her voice cracked. She tried again, barely more than a whisper. "He gets loud. When he drinks. Mommy cries." Ranger's ears twitched sharply, his body shifting closer. He let out a low sound, not a growl, but something closer to a whine, soft, tuned to her fear. Sophie's eyes flicked to him, and she reached instinctively, her hand tangling in his fur once more. Daniel watched, the bond forming between them clearer than words. She trusted Ranger in ways she couldn't yet trust him. He didn't take offense. Trust had to start somewhere, and Ranger had always had a way of reaching people who'd shut themselves off. He looked back down at the drawing. The scribbled face loomed at him, even in its simplicity. He thought of the anger it must have taken for a child to press her crayon so hard, to rip into the paper, as if trying to erase someone's existence. He folded it gently and slipped it into a pocket. Not to take it away, but to preserve it. "You did good, Sophie," Daniel said softly. "Thank you for showing me. That was very brave." Her eyes flickered toward him, unsure whether to believe him, but she didn't protest. She leaned her cheek further against Ranger's side, the shepherd's steady breathing a lull against the storm outside. Daniel turned his eyes back to the road, but his thoughts burned with the weight of the drawing. Whoever the man was, Sophie's fear of him was absolute. And if Sophie had run, if her mother had told her to run, then that woman was still out there, trapped in whatever nightmare this child had just escaped. The smell of smoke. Sophie must have carried on her hair and clothes, seemed stronger now in Daniel's memory, clinging to the edges of his senses. He imagined a cabin, a shadow pacing, anger spilling into fists. A woman's screams carried over the river. Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. In the back seat, Sophie whispered something he almost didn't catch. "He told me. He said no one cares. That nobody comes when we scream." The words cut through the hum of the heater. Daniel's chest ached, anger sparking like fire in his gut. He looked back through the mirror, meeting her eyes. "He was wrong," he said firmly. Sophie blinked at him, uncertainty lingering. But her hand stayed pressed against Ranger, and for the first time, her breathing began to slow into something close to steady. Daniel let the quiet return. Snow hissed softly against the glass, the wipers sweeping it away in rhythmic arcs. Ahead, the lights of Willow Creek were still distant, faint glows rising against the dark horizon. He glanced once more at the folded drawing in his pocket. That faceless figure, crossed out in rage and fear, wasn't just a sketch. It was a map, a warning, and, he thought grimly, it was the key to finding whoever still waited in the dark. The snow thickened as they drew closer to Willow Creek, flakes drifting heavy and slow across the windshield. Inside the SUV, the warmth of the heater spread, but Daniel felt no comfort. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, restless, his mind circling the weight of the folded drawing in his pocket. Behind him, Sophie stirred. She had grown quieter, though not calmer. Her eyes darted between the glass, Ranger's flank, and her own small hands, which twisted nervously in the folds of the oversized coat. Each breath was shallow, caught between exhaustion and fear. Daniel glanced at her in the mirror. "Sophie," he said softly, careful not to startle her. "Can you tell me more about him? The man in the picture?" Her body stiffened. She pressed closer to Ranger, fingers tangling in the thick fur of his neck. The shepherd shifted only slightly, lowering his head until it rested across her lap, as if to ground her. For a long while, there was no answer, just the hum of the tires against the frozen road. Then, in a voice so quiet Daniel had to lean to hear it, Sophie whispered, "He has a scar." Daniel's gaze sharpened in the mirror. "A scar?" She nodded, her small hand rising to trace across her cheek, from just below her eye down to the corner of her jaw. "Like this," she murmured. "Red. Ugly. He touches it when he's angry." Daniel's chest tightened. He'd seen men like that before. Soldiers who wore their scars as warnings, or abusers who wore them like excuses. He kept his voice steady, gentle. "You did good, Sophie. That helps a lot. Do you know his name?" Her lips parted, but she shook her head quickly, eyes clouding. Mommy called him Jack sometimes, but when she did, he got louder." She shivered at the memory, clutching Ranger's fur tighter. Daniel swallowed hard, anger rising beneath his ribs. He forced it back down. "All right, Jack," he repeated softly. "We'll figure out the rest. What about your mommy? Do you know where she is now?" The question hung heavy. Sophie's eyes flicked to the window, her small body curling tighter. For a moment, Daniel worried she might retreat altogether, shut down the way traumatized children sometimes did. But then she lifted one trembling hand and pointed vaguely toward the darkness outside. "He took her," she whispered, "to the gray house, the one near the river. He dragged her." Her voice cracked. "I wanted to stay, but Mommy screamed at me to run." The words struck Daniel harder than any winter wind. He could almost see it, the small house sagging by the waterline, shadows thick against its frame. A scarred man's fist, a woman's desperate cry, a child's feet pounding through snow because running was the only chance left. He pulled in a breath, steadying himself. This wasn't just a lost child anymore. This was an active crime, a woman's life still hanging in the balance. Reaching for the radio, Daniel pressed the button, his voice low but firm. "Dispatch, this is Officer Ward, badge 327. I've got a juvenile female recovered, named Sophie Miller, approximately age 5. She reports her mother is being held against her will at an unknown structure. Gray house, near the river outside Willow Creek. Possible suspect male, mid-30s to 40s, identifiable by long diagonal facial scar. Suspect history of violent behavior. Copy." The line crackled, the dispatcher's voice coming back sharper now. "Copy that, 327. Medical and child services en route to station. Do you require backup at your location?" Daniel glanced at Sophie. She sat stiff, wide-eyed, as though the very sound of the radio had reminded her that words spoken aloud carried weight. He adjusted his tone. "Negative on backup for now. Child is secured in vehicle. Proceeding to station. Notify Detective Hartman of potential domestic hostage situation. We'll need her on call. 10-4, Officer Ward. Stay safe out there." The radio clicked silent again. Daniel set it back into its cradle, his jaw tight. He felt the road unspool beneath the tires, each mile heavy with urgency. Sophie's words looped in his mind. The gray house near the river. He knew that stretch of land, half-forgotten logging cabins, abandoned shacks once used by trappers decades ago, places where no one would think to look unless they were led there. In the back seat, Sophie shifted, her voice trembling. He said nobody would come, that nobody cares. Daniel turned slightly, meeting her eyes through the mirror. His voice was quiet, but carried an edge that brooked no argument. He was wrong. I'm here, and we're not going to stop until your mom is safe. She blinked at him, uncertain at first, but Ranger's steady presence seemed to fill the gap between them. The shepherd let out a soft huff, his ears twitching as if agreeing. Sophie's hand smoothed against his fur, a tiny anchor in a storm too large for her. Daniel faced the road again, snow whirling in the headlights. Already the night felt heavier, the shadows thicker. He had no doubt the man with the scar believed himself invisible, tucked away by the river where screams went unheard. But Sophie had carried the truth out of those woods, and now the hunt had begun. He pressed his foot gently on the accelerator, urging the SUV faster toward Willow Creek. Somewhere out there, a mother was waiting, and a scarred man was about to learn that his darkness had been found. The police station in Willow Creek was small, more accustomed to traffic stops and logging disputes than to the kind of terror that had stepped in from the woods tonight. Yet in the back corner of the building, down a narrow hall where the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, an interview room had been prepared. The room itself was stark, white walls, a scuffed table, 2 vinyl benches, but someone had placed a fleece blanket over one of the seats, and a paper cup of cocoa steamed faintly on the table. The sweetness of chocolate clung to the air, almost masking the antiseptic tang of old cleaning supplies. Sophie sat curled on the bench, Daniel's coat still wrapped around her shoulders. Her small body seemed swallowed by the fabric, her knees drawn up beneath it as though she could fold herself into invisibility. She held the cup of cocoa in both hands, but she hadn't taken a sip. Steam curled against her pale cheeks, fogging the strands of hair that had fallen loose across her face. Across from her sat Helen Graves, the county's senior child services counselor. Helen was in her early 50s, a calm presence softened by years of listening to broken voices. She wore a navy cardigan over a collared shirt, her silver hair pinned back neatly. Her voice never pushed. It invited. "Whenever you're ready, sweetheart," Helen said gently, her hands folded on the table. "There's no rush. You're safe here. No one can hurt you now." Sophie didn't answer, only pressed her lips tighter around the rim of the cup without drinking. In the corner, Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest, jaw clenched tight. He hadn't meant to stay. The protocol was clear. Let child services handle the interview. Give the counselor space to build trust. But the thought of leaving the little girl alone, even with someone as capable as Helen, scraped against something raw inside him. So he remained, a quiet shadow at the edge of the room. His gaze never left Sophie. He saw every tremor, every time her eyes darted toward the door as though expecting someone to burst through. She was small, fragile, but the silence that wrapped her was not weakness. It was survival. He knew that silence well. It was the same kind that had once followed him home after deployments, when words were too dangerous to speak aloud. Beside the door, Ranger lay stretched across the floor like a sentinel. His head rested on his paws, but his ears were pricked forward, every sound in the room filtering through him. His eyes, dark, unblinking, remained fixed on Sophie. Every so often, his chest rose in a deep, steady breath, a rhythm as sure as the ticking clock on the wall. Helen glanced once toward Daniel, then back to Sophie. She shifted slightly, softening her posture. "Do you know what I like about dogs?" she asked, her tone conversational, as if they were simply talking in a kitchen. "They don't need us to say everything. They understand just by being close. Have you noticed that?" Sophie's eyes flickered toward Ranger. The shepherd hadn't moved, but his gaze had never wavered. Slowly, her small hand emerged from beneath the coat, trembling as it reached out across the gap. Her fingertips brushed the edge of his fur. Ranger didn't flinch. He let her hand settle, the steady warmth of his body anchoring her in a room that still felt too cold. Helen smiled softly. "See? He already knows you." Something shifted in Sophie then. Her shoulders lowered just a fraction, her grip on the cocoa loosening. She didn't speak, but her hand stayed pressed to the shepherd, as though drawing courage from the rise and fall of his breath. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. He forced himself not to move, not to break the fragile connection forming in front of him. Ranger was doing what he himself could not, breaking through the walls of silence without a single word. Helen leaned forward just slightly, her voice still gentle. "Can you tell me your name, sweetheart? Only if you want to." Sophie's lips parted, a whisper escaping like a breath. "Sophie." "Sophie Miller." Helen nodded, her smile small but warm. "That's a beautiful name. Thank you for telling me." The clock ticked softly. Sophie's eyes lowered again, her fingers tightening in Ranger's fur. The cocoa on the table had grown cooler, forgotten. Daniel shifted his weight, his arms folding tighter. He wanted to step forward, to promise the girl that she'd never again have to face the man with the scar. But promises, he knew, couldn't be made lightly. Not until the threat was truly gone. Still, standing in that corner, he made one to himself. Helen's voice pulled him back. "Do you know where your mommy is now, Sophie?" The question hung fragile in the air. Sophie's eyes welled suddenly, tears trembling on her lashes. She shook her head once, then whispered so faintly Daniel almost missed it. "He has her." Helen's expression softened, her voice steady. "The man with the scar." Sophie nodded, her hand dragging across her own cheek in a diagonal line. "Here," she murmured, touching from eye to jaw. Ranger's ears twitched at the movement, his head lifting slightly as though alert to her fear. Daniel's chest tightened. He had to press his back against the wall to keep from stepping forward. This was why he hadn't been able to leave the room. Because every word out of the child's mouth was another piece of the puzzle, another echo of a woman still trapped somewhere in the dark. Helen reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on the edge, not touching Sophie, but leaving the choice open. "You're very brave for telling me this, and you don't have to be afraid anymore. We're going to help your mom, I promise." Sophie's lips trembled. She didn't take the hand, but her own small palm pressed harder into Ranger's side, her anchor against the storm. Daniel exhaled slowly, his chest heavy with a mix of grief and resolve. He knew what was coming. The man with the scar wasn't just a ghost from Sophie's memory. He was alive, real, and holding her mother somewhere near the river. And as long as Daniel Ward stood in this station, neither Sophie Miller nor her mother would be left to face him alone. The cocoa on the table had gone lukewarm, its steam long since faded. Sophie still cradled the cup in both hands as though it were a shield, though she hadn't taken a sip. Her eyes fixed on the dark liquid, reflecting the fluorescent light overhead, and for a long time she said nothing. Helen Graves waited, patient as stone. Years of experience had taught her that silence was not empty. It was the shape of something trying to break through. She sat steady across the table, her hands folded loosely, her voice gentle when it finally came. "You're doing very well, Sophie. If you feel ready, you can tell me a little more about the man, the one with the scar." At the mention, Sophie flinched. Her shoulders tightened beneath Daniel's heavy coat, her knuckles whitening around the cup. Ranger's head lifted instantly from the floor, his ears angling forward. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. The shepherd's eyes, steady and dark, found hers across the small gap. For the first time, Sophie spoke without being asked. Her voice was fragile, carrying the cadence of memory. "It's here." Her hand rose slowly, trembling, dragging 2 fingers down her cheek in a diagonal from the corner of her eye to her jaw. "It's ugly, pink and shiny. He says it makes him strong." Daniel's stomach clenched. He could see it vividly already, the scar marking a face twisted by rage. He forced himself to stay still in the corner, arms folded tightly, watching as Helen leaned closer. "And when he gets angry," Helen prompted softly. Sophie's lips pressed together, her chin trembling. He yells so loud. The walls shake. Sometimes he breaks things. The bottles." Her voice cracked. "He drinks from them, and then he throws them. Mommy tries to be quiet, but it doesn't matter. He gets louder." The words tumbled out faster now, as if once released they could not be contained. Sophie's chest rose and fell quickly, her eyes darting between Helen and Ranger, never to Daniel. She spoke to the shepherd most of all, her hand reaching out again to tangle in his fur. "He hit the table once and it broke. Mommy cried. He laughed." She swallowed hard, the tears spilling hot now down her pale cheeks. "He says no one will come. He says we belong to him, that the scar proves it." Helen's eyes softened, her voice steady as a blanket. "And what did your mommy do when he got angry?" Sophie blinked hard, her breath hitching. "She told me to run." The silence after those words was absolute. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to pause. "She was screaming," Sophie whispered. She said, "Run, Sophie. Don't look back." So I did. I ran out the door. My feet hurt, but I kept going. I heard her scream again. I heard him. And then... Her small voice collapsed into a sob. "And then I left her." The cup of cocoa slipped from her hands, landing softly on the blanket beside her. She curled forward, burying her face in the coat, shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs no 5-year-old should know. Ranger moved immediately. With a fluid, deliberate motion, he rose and pressed his body against the bench where she sat. His great head nudged under her arm until she clung to him instead of the empty fabric. The shepherd's chest rose slow and steady, anchoring her against the storm of her grief. Helen reached a hand across the table, resting it on the fleece near Sophie's knee, not touching her, just there. "Sophie, listen to me," she said firmly but gently. "You did exactly what your mommy needed you to do. You didn't leave her. You saved yourself, so we could find you, so you could tell us. That was the bravest thing you could have done." Sophie shook her head violently, words muffled against Ranger's fur. "No, I should have stayed. I should have helped her." Daniel's chest twisted. He stepped forward at last, unable to remain against the wall. His voice was low, gravelly with the weight of memory. "Sophie." She looked up, startled by the sound. He crouched to her level, his eyes steady on hers. "I was a soldier once," he said quietly. "I know what it feels like to leave someone behind. It hurts here." He pressed a hand against his chest. "But your mom told you to run because she loves you more than anything. She wanted you safe, and you listened. That doesn't make you weak. That makes you strong. Strong enough to help us find her." Sophie blinked at him, her small chest still heaving with sobs. She looked down at Ranger, then back at Daniel. Something in his tone, in the blunt honesty of it, seemed to cut through the fog of guilt. Her hand didn't loosen in the shepherd's fur, but her sobs slowed. Helen gave Daniel a brief nod of gratitude before turning back to Sophie. "Your mom is very lucky to have you, Sophie. You brought us the truth. That's the only way we can find her." Sophie sniffled hard, rubbing at her eyes with the edge of the coat. Her voice came again, softer but clearer now. "The house. It's gray. By the river. He took her there." Daniel felt the words strike him like coordinates falling into place. His jaw clenched, his mind already mapping the river's edge where old cabins and abandoned houses stood, hidden by years of disuse. Helen soothed. "That's very helpful, sweetheart. You've been so brave tonight." Sophie didn't answer, but she leaned more fully against Ranger, burying her face in the shepherd's coat. Ranger remained utterly still, his eyes locked on Daniel as though to say, "Now you know. Now do something." And Daniel, crouched on the floor of that interview room, silently vowed that he would. The station had grown quiet after midnight. Most of the deputies had gone home, leaving only a skeleton crew in dispatch and the occasional patrol checking icy roads. The hum of fluorescent lights and the soft whir of the heating system filled the silence. Daniel sat alone at his desk, a mug of coffee cooling untouched at his elbow. The screen of the old department computer glowed pale in the dim office, casting shadows across his tired face. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. He had heard Sophie's words over and over, scar on his face, bottles breaking, mommy screaming, the grey house by the river. Every fragment pressed against him like a weight. He needed to know who this man was, needed more than a name whispered in terror. With a steady breath, Daniel logged into the database, the screen blinking as if reluctant to reveal what it knew. He began with the name Sophie had given between sobs, Jack. It was thin, too common. But cross it with Eleanor Miller, her mother's name, and the search began to narrow. Files appeared. Reports long buried under bureaucratic dust, pulled up now in stark black text. Daniel clicked through, his jaw tightening with each new detail. The first intake photo of Elena flashed across the screen. She was younger then, though exhaustion already shadowed her eyes. A bruise darkened her cheekbone. A cut split her lip. Her gaze stared at the camera, wide but distant, the look of someone holding herself together by sheer will. Daniel felt his chest constrict. Attached to the report was the name, Jack Rowan. He clicked deeper. Rowan, 38. Former infantry, dishonorably discharged 6 years ago for assaulting a fellow soldier during a drunken brawl overseas. Records of bar fights, arrests for disorderly conduct, charges of aggravated assault. A rap sheet that stretched like a map of violence. Daniel scrolled further, his hand tightening on the mouse. Rowan had been arrested twice for domestic violence, both complaints filed by Elena Miller. The first had resulted in a short jail sentence, the second in a longer stay, 7 months behind bars. Each time, Elena had withdrawn her statement before trial, leaving the case to collapse. Daniel knew that pattern too well. Victims caught in cycles of fear, coerced into silence, convinced no one could protect them. He pulled up the mugshot. Rowan stared back at him from the screen, jaw square, eyes like cold stone. And there, running diagonally from his left eye to the edge of his jaw, was the scar, red and puckered, unmistakable even in the grainy photo. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. Sophie's description hadn't been a child's frightened exaggeration. It was exact. The computer's hum filled the room as he sat staring at the image. Rowan's face seemed to burn in the pale light. A scar that wasn't just flesh, but history carved deep. Daniel rubbed a hand across his eyes. His own reflection in the dark monitor glass looked haggard, haunted. He thought of Sophie curled against Ranger in the interview room, her small hand tangled in fur, whispering that she had left her mother behind. He thought of Elena's bruises in the old intake photo, the exhaustion in her eyes even then. This man wasn't going to stop. Not until someone stopped him. Daniel clicked into release records. Rowan had been out less than 4 months. His probation officer's notes sparse, citing uncooperative but technically compliant. No fixed residence listed, just the phrase, transient housing, county border. That matched Sophie's description perfectly. The grey house near the river, a place off the grid where screams could vanish into the water. Daniel's stomach tightened with resolve. He reached for the phone on his desk, dialing a number he hadn't used in months. It rang twice before a voice answered, sharp and awake despite the late hour. Detective Hartman. Daniel gripped the receiver, his tone low but steady. Isla, it's Ward. I need you on something urgent. Do you remember a man named Jack Rowan? A pause, then a rustle of papers on her end. Rowan, yes. Elena Miller's file crossed my desk once. Is she in trouble again? Daniel glanced toward the closed door of the interview room, where Sophie was sleeping at last under Ranger's guard. His jaw tightened. More than trouble. Rowan's out. He has her. And this time, there's a child involved. Silence hummed across the line, heavier than static. Then Isla's voice sharpened. Send me what you have. I'll be there at dawn. Daniel set the phone down, the decision already etched into his bones. He turned back to the screen, staring once more at Rowan's scar. In it, he saw every bottle thrown, every scream ignored, every child forced to run barefoot into the night. He saw not just a man, but a pattern, a predator who believed no one would come. Daniel's fists clenched on the desk. This time, someone would. Ranger shifted at the door, as if hearing the vow in his silence. The shepherd's ears twitched, his head lifting, eyes catching Daniel's across the room. It was enough. Daniel closed the file, the scarred face lingering behind his eyes long after the screen went dark. The station was quieter now, the kind of silence that only came in the small hours of the morning. Snow continued to drift outside, tapping faintly against the tall windows. A thin hum of fluorescent lights hung over the room, accompanied by the occasional crackle of the police radio from dispatch. But for Daniel, seated alone at his desk with the pale glow of the computer still etched into his vision, everything felt sharpened to a single point. Jack Rowan. The name lingered in his mind like a bruise. The scarred face on the mugshot was burned into him, each detail aligning with Sophie's halting description. Elena's bruises from years past, her withdrawn statements, the endless pattern of fear, it all came crashing together. And now a child had run barefoot into the snow to escape him. Daniel rubbed at his temple, exhaustion creeping in, but the weight of urgency was heavier. He couldn't let Rowan slip into the shadows again. Not this time. He reached for the phone. His hand hovered for a moment over the keypad, his thumb brushing the numbers almost absently. There were a dozen contacts he could call, state investigators, county prosecutors, but none of them would move as fast. None of them would fight with the same fire. Only one name came to mind, Detective Isla Hartman. She'd worked with the Regional Domestic Violence Unit for years. Daniel had seen her tear into cases that everyone else dismissed as messy family disputes. He'd watched her stand unshaken against defense attorneys who tried to paint victims as liars. Isla had earned her reputation not through loud speeches, but through relentlessness. He dialed. The ring barely lasted 2 cycles before a voice answered, sharp and awake despite the late hour. Hartman. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low, controlled. Isla. It's Ward. There was a pause on the other end, a faint rustle of papers. Daniel? It's been a while. You calling at this hour means it isn't small talk. He exhaled, his tone tight. I've got a child at the station. Name's Sophie Miller, 5 years old. Found her barefoot in the woods tonight. Says her mother's being held. He heard the shift in Isla's breathing, the steel settling in her tone. By who? Daniel hesitated only a moment before saying the name. Jack Rowan. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint buzz of the line. When Isla spoke again, her voice had sharpened like a blade. Rowan. Christ. He's out? Released 4 months ago, Daniel confirmed. No fixed address. Probation notes were useless, but Sophie gave me details. Scar on his face, drinking, violent outbursts. She says he dragged Eleanor Miller to a grey house near the river. You know as well as I do what that means. Isla cursed under her breath, low but fervent. That bastard should have never seen daylight. I told the court as much. And Elena. Her words faltered for just a second, then hardened again. She came to me once, you know. Asked about relocation programs, shelters. She never followed through. Daniel's jaw tightened. He must have found her before she could get out. Sophie ran because Elena told her to. That girl is sitting in my interview room blaming herself for leaving her mother behind. He heard Isla's sharp inhale. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of resolve. Then we don't waste time. Rowan's escalating. If he's dragged her off grid, it won't be long before this ends in a body bag. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. Not if we move first. There was no hesitation in her reply. Send me what you've got. Address history, mugshots, Sophie's statement. I'll be on the road before sunrise. Daniel glanced toward the closed door of the interview room, where Ranger still kept watch at Sophie's side. His voice dropped, quiet but firm. She's depending on us, Isla. We can't let him vanish again. Her tone softened for the first time, but only slightly. I know. And Daniel, don't carry this alone. You've done your part tonight. Now, let me do mine. He leaned back in his chair, the exhaustion pressing heavier, but beneath it burned a thread of relief. Isla was the kind of ally you called when you needed certainty, and certainty was exactly what this case demanded. I'll send the files in 5 minutes, Daniel said. Good. I'll meet you at Willow Creek Station by dawn. Keep the girl safe. And Daniel, watch your back. Rowan doesn't go down easy. The line clicked, leaving only the hum of static before silence returned. Daniel set the receiver down slowly, staring at the scarred face still frozen on his computer screen. Rowan's eyes, cold and unyielding, seemed to stare back at him. But now, there was something else. Something Rowan didn't know yet. He wasn't just up against one officer in a small mountain town. He was about to have Isla Hartman on his trail. And together, Daniel thought grimly, they would not leave Elena Miller behind. Ranger shifted at the door, as if sensing the vow. His ears flicked, his eyes catching Daniel's across the room. Daniel gave the shepherd a small nod, a wordless promise that the fight was no longer his alone. The snow outside thickened, blanketing the streets of Willow Creek. But inside the station, the air had changed. The hunt had begun. By dawn, Willow Creek was buried under a fresh layer of snow. The plows hadn't yet reached the smaller streets near the station, and the world outside lay hushed beneath its white mantle. Pale light seeped slowly through the clouds, grey and thin, turning the mountains into silhouettes carved against the sky. Inside the station, the quiet held steady. Daniel sat at the long oak table in the briefing room, his sleeves rolled up, the mug of untouched coffee beside him long gone cold. A manila folder lay open before him, filled with printouts of Rowan's record, Eleanor's intake photos, and Sophie's drawing, carefully smoothed from its creases. He had read through it all a dozen times in the last few hours, but the weight of it hadn't lessened. The sound of tires crunching against ice broke the silence. Daniel rose as headlights swept across the frosted windows. Moments later, the front door opened, and Detective Isla Hartman stepped inside, her boots shedding snow, her face drawn with focus. She carried a satchel slung over her shoulder, and under her arm a roll of maps, their edges frayed from use. "Ward," she greeted, her tone brisk but steady. "Detective." He gave a nod, relief flickering briefly in his eyes. Isla shrugged out of her winter coat, hanging it on a hook near the door. She wore a dark blazer over a sweater, her hair pulled back tight. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the room, locking on the folder spread across the table. "Rowan," she muttered, setting down her satchel with a thud. "I can't say I'm surprised. When I heard his name last night, I barely slept. Knew it was only a matter of time before he'd resurface." Daniel gestured to the table. "Then let's make sure this is the last time." She unrolled the maps across the surface, pinning the corners with her satchel and a stack of case files. Aerial photos from old forestry surveys stared up at them. Patches of wilderness, twisting logging trails, and the dark ribbon of the river cutting through the valley. Isla tapped a gloved finger against one section. "This is where the old cabins sit. Most of them are rotting, but some are still intact enough to use. No utilities, no registered ownership. Perfect for someone who doesn't want to be found." Daniel leaned in, his eyes scanning the grainy black and white images. The cabins huddled near bends in the river, half hidden by forest cover. Exactly the kind of place Sophie had described in her broken whispers. "She said grey house," Daniel murmured, "by the river." He dragged her mother there. That narrows it to... Isla was already flipping through her files, pulling a weathered photo from the stack. "This one." She slid it across the table. It showed a cabin, 2 stories sagging into themselves, the wood bleached gray by decades of storms. The roofline dipped unevenly, the windows boarded, smoke stains darkened the chimney. Daniel exhaled slowly, recognition sparking in his chest. "That's it." Isla glanced up at him. "The child said that?" He nodded. "She described it clearly enough. She might only be 5, but she remembers. The scar, the drinking, the house by the river. She didn't make it up." His voice tightened. "And she blames herself for leaving her mother behind." Isla's expression hardened, her jaw set. That's how men like Rowan control them. Fear, guilt. They break their voices before they even start speaking. Daniel slid Sophie's drawing across the table. She drew this, him, faceless, crossed out. It's the way she sees him. Isla studied the paper for a long moment, her fingers brushing lightly across the heavy black strokes that tore through the page. Her eyes narrowed. A child's truth is often more direct than ours. She's telling us he doesn't belong in their world. That's why we end it. Ranger shifted near the door, his body rising from where he had lain. His nails clicked softly against the linoleum as he padded closer, head tilted as though listening to every word. Daniel reached down to scratch the shepherd's ear, grounding himself. He's been alert all night. It's like he knows this isn't just another case. Isla's gaze softened slightly at the sight of the dog. He's right. This is different. Rowan won't surrender easy. He thrives on control. And if he feels it slipping... She let the thought hang, the unspoken danger filling the space between them. Daniel straightened, his voice steady. That's why we move fast. Sophie's testimony, the scar, the house, it all lines up. If we wait, Eleanor might not survive long enough for another chance. Isla gathered the files back into a neat stack, tucking the maps beneath them. I'll file for a warrant en route, but we both know by the time paperwork clears, he could be gone. So we plan for immediacy, just us, and anyone we trust not to spook him. Daniel nodded. Agreed. He paused, glancing again toward the closed door of the interview room where Sophie slept under Ranger's quiet guard. She doesn't know it yet, but her courage gave us everything we need. We can't waste it. Isla's eyes followed his, her voice lowering. Children shouldn't have to be brave, but when they are, we owe it to them to carry it forward. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. Snow fell heavier outside, blanketing Willow Creek, but inside the station the air thrummed with urgency. Two officers, bound by years of scars, and the testimony of a child, staring down the path toward a scarred man hiding by the river. Isla rolled up the maps again, sliding them into her satchel. Her voice was calm but resolute. We'll find her, and when we do, Rowan won't have anywhere left to hide. Daniel met her gaze, the unspoken vow settling between them like steel. Then let's move. Ranger's ears flicked at the words, as though marking the moment. The hunt was no longer a question. It was a promise. The briefing room had shifted from silence to motion. Files, maps, and drone photographs lay spread across the table, lit by the grey light of dawn filtering through frosted windows. The snow outside had thickened overnight, but Daniel knew the cover of the storm and cold worked both ways. It hid Rowan just as easily as it masked their approach. Isla Hartman pulled on her tactical vest, the black straps snapping into place with practiced ease. She moved methodically, each adjustment precise, each piece of gear checked twice. Years of fieldwork had made her wary of chance. We'll take only what we can carry in silence, she said, more to herself than anyone. If Rowan hears us coming, he'll use her as a shield. Daniel was already strapping his own vest into place. The Velcro rasped loud in the small room. He reached for his sidearm, checked the chamber, then holstered it with steady hands. The ritual was familiar, but tonight it carried more weight. This wasn't a raid on a meth den or a barroom brawl gone too far. This was a mother's life, balanced against the edge of a scarred man's rage. On the table, the drone images lay fanned out like a deck of cards. Grainy photographs of the river bend, patches of dark roof lines obscured by pines, narrow foot trails nearly invisible under the snow. Isla traced one with her gloved finger. Here, she murmured, the grey structure. Smoke marks on the chimney, partially collapsed roof. This is where he's keeping her. Daniel leaned closer, his jaw set. And no neighbors for miles. Exactly how he wants it, Isla replied. At the far end of the room, Sophie stirred on the bench where she had been sleeping. The fleece blanket had slipped from her shoulders, her small frame shivering despite the warmth inside. Ranger was beside her immediately, pressing close, his steady presence keeping her anchored. Daniel crossed the room quietly, crouching down so that his eyes were level with hers when she blinked awake. Her hair clung to her cheeks, her eyes red from the tears of the night before. She clutched the blanket tighter. When she realized the room was filled with weapons and vests and maps, she didn't understand. He softened his voice. "Morning, Sophie. You're safe here. We're getting ready to go find your mom." Her lips parted, but no sound came at first. Then, in a whisper edged with fear, she asked, "You promise?" Daniel nodded without hesitation. "I promise. We're going to bring her back. You were brave enough to run to us, and now it's our turn to be brave for you." She looked at him, searching his face as if weighing whether adults could keep promises. Finally, her small hand reached out, curling into Ranger's fur. The shepherd stood tall beside her, ears alert, his eyes flicking between Daniel and the child. "Don't let him forget her," Sophie whispered, her words almost lost in the quiet. She pressed her face against Ranger's neck, voice muffled. "Don't let him forget." Daniel's chest tightened, the plea burrowing deeper than any oath he'd spoken under the law. He placed his hand over Ranger's broad shoulder, his voice low but certain. "He won't. Ranger remembers, and so do I." For a moment, the three of them, man, child, and dog, remained bound in that silent pact. The kind of promise that was not written in reports, but carved into the marrow of those who carried it. Isla cleared her throat gently from the table, her tone measured but not unkind. "We move within the hour. Weather's closing in, and the longer we wait, the more time Rowan has to improvise." She didn't say the darker possibilities aloud. She didn't have to. Daniel rose, giving Sophie one last steady look before turning back to the maps. He took the scrap of fabric from his pocket, the torn piece of Sophie's dress he had found snagged in the SUV door. It was faintly stained, the edge ragged, but it carried her scent still. He held it out to Ranger. The shepherd sniffed once, then again, his body straightening as recognition rippled through him. His ears pricked, his tail stiffened, and his eyes sharpened into focus. Daniel's chest swelled with a grim kind of pride. "He's ready." Isla gathered the drone images, sliding them into a waterproof case. "Then so are we." The station hummed faintly with preparation, the shuffle of boots, the click of weapons being checked, the low murmur of radios. But Daniel's mind was already on the cabin by the river, on Elena's face in the intake photo, on Sophie's trembling hand pressed into Ranger's coat. When they stepped outside into the pale morning, the cold bit deep, crisp and unrelenting. The SUVs idled in the lot, exhaust curling into the frosted air. Snow crunched underfoot, and the mountains loomed silent, holding secrets within their folds. Daniel tightened the strap of his vest, his eyes narrowing against the wind. "Let's go bring her home." Ranger leapt into the back of the vehicle, his breath fogging the glass, as he turned to watch Sophie through the window. She raised her small hand in a hesitant wave, her eyes too old for her years. Daniel slid into the driver's seat, his promise echoing in his chest like a drumbeat. Sophie had asked them not to forget. And forgetting was not an option. The world before sunrise was trapped between silence and breath. Mist rose from the valleys like smoke, curling through the frost-laden pines. To Daniel, stepping off the trail, the forest felt less like wilderness and more like a cathedral. Branches arched overhead, silence waited with prayer. Every sound was magnified, boots crunching crusted snow, Isla chambering around, Ranger's steady breath in the cold. The shepherd pressed forward, nose to the ground, locked on the scent of Sophie's torn dress. He barked once, decisive. "He's locked in," Daniel murmured. Isla nodded, rifle steady. "Then we follow." They moved in silence, breath hanging in clouds, mist carrying the metallic tang of river water, and the faint trace of wood smoke. Daniel's mind repeated old patrol rhythms. Scan, move, breathe, repeat. But this wasn't war. It was a promise. Don't let him forget her. Sophie's plea gnawed at him. The dog wove through brush with precision. Ahead, the river glinted under the dull dawn. Daniel pictured Elena's desperate flight, dragged through the same trees. Then Ranger froze, ears stiff, growl rumbling. Daniel's fist rose, halting the team. Through mist, a thin line of smoke betrayed human presence. Daniel whispered, "Half a mile." Isler's jaw tightened. That's him. He won't go easy. The shepherd led them deeper, until the shape of a shack emerged from shadows. Sagging boards, crooked chimney, jagged planks across windows, and smoke rising still. Daniel's breath caught. This wasn't a rumor. Rowan was here. Elena was inside. Ranger crouched low, growl vibrating through the frozen silence. Isla whispered, "That's it." Daniel's pulse hammered. Sophie had been right. The shack loomed larger. Warped boards, broken shutter, bitter smell of liquor laced with smoke. Daniel's grip tightened around his rifle. He has a scar. He gets loud when he drinks. Mommy told me to run. Sophie's words were carved into his chest. They circled wide, moving slowly. Ranger paused again, nose twitching, then turned back. They're inside. Daniel crouched behind roots, rifle leveled. The shack was 30 feet away, suffocating in mist. Then a voice broke the silence, raw and ragged. "You think they care about you? You're mine, Elena. Always were." A crash followed, wood splintering, fists against walls. Then came sobbing, muffled and desperate. Daniel's chest locked. This wasn't a battle. It was a mother trapped, a child waiting to be saved. He signaled hold. Isla crouched beside a pine, pistol checked, her face cut from steel. Ranger quivered, muscles coiled, a low thunder in his chest. Rowan's voice rose, slurred with alcohol. "You think you can run? That brat won't save you. No one's coming." Another crash. Elena's cry broke through, then stifled again. Daniel's breath fogged, jaw tight. He glanced at Isla. She nodded once. Breach was inevitable. He touched Ranger's back, whispering, "Not yet." The shepherd stilled, eyes locked on the door. Another shout. "Look at me when I talk to you." Elena's broken plea. "Please, not in front of her." Daniel felt Sophie's voice echo inside him. "Don't let him forget her." He signaled Isla. Flank left. She melted into the mist, pistol steady. Through a boarded window, firelight flickered, shadows pacing and trembling. Daniel steadied his rifle, pulse hammering. Ranger crouched low, growling and vibrating. The shack was seconds away. Inside, rage filled every corner. Daniel whispered, steady, final, "On my signal." The forest held its breath. Daniel crouched low, frost biting through his knee, his hand hovering over Ranger's trembling shoulders. The shepherd quivered, a coiled spring, eyes fixed on the shack. Isla's shadow melted through the mist on the flank, pistol raised, waiting. Inside, Rowan's voice thundered, "You don't breathe unless I tell you to." Elena's cry answered, jagged with pain. Daniel gave the signal. In a blur, his boot hit the porch, his shoulder slammed the door. The shack exploded in chaos. "Police! Drop it, Rowan!" The scene burned itself into his mind. Elena, bound and bleeding against the wall, Rowan, scar glinting in firelight, wild eyes bloodshot, one hand gripping a broken bottle, the other yanking Eleanor close as a shield. "Back off or I'll gut her," he bellowed. Eleanor whimpered, terror in her eyes. Daniel's rifle locked steady. "It's over. Sophie's safe. She told us everything." The name made Rowan falter, confusion flickering. "Sophie." Daniel pressed harder. "She's not afraid of you anymore," Rowan snarled, pressing the glass to Elena's throat. But then Ranger growled, low, primal, a sound older than words. "Call him off," Rowan roared, panic flashing. Daniel's voice cut like steel. "He's not here for me, Rowan." "He's here for her." The room tightened, firelight twitching across warped walls. For one heartbeat, no one moved. Then, Ranger launched. The shepherd hit like a missile, jaws clamping Rowan's bottle arm. Flesh cracked, the bottle shattered. Elena fell free. Rowan howled, staggering as Ranger dragged him down, blood streaking across the floor. "Stay down," Daniel barked. Rifle steady. Isla burst through the flank, pistol trained. Rowan flailed, cursing, but every strike only drove Ranger's teeth deeper. Elena crawled clear, sobbing, wrists raw. Daniel shouted, "Stay back!" His eyes never left Rowan. Ranger twisted, pulling the scarred man to the ground. Rowan's screams turned shrill, desperate. "Call him off!" he shrieked. Daniel's reply was nice. "He remembers who you hurt." At last, Daniel commanded, "Ranger, out!" The shepherd released instantly, muzzle bloodied but unyielding, still standing guard. Rowan writhed, clutching his mangled arm, fear finally cracking his rage. "On your stomach," Daniel ordered. Broken, Rowan obeyed. Isla cuffed him hard to the floorboards. The metallic click was final. The predator was caged. Daniel lowered his rifle just enough to move to Elena. She trembled, eyes wide with disbelief. "He said no one would come," she whispered, tears spilling. "You're safe now," Daniel said softly, cutting the ropes. The moment she was free, Eleanor collapsed, sobs pouring out like years of silence, shattering. Ranger moved beside her, pressing his head against her knee. Her hand found his fur, clinging to the only anchor she trusted. Then her voice broke, fragile, desperate. "Is she alive?" Daniel's chest tightened. "She is. Sophie's safe. She saved you." Elena's sobs turned to gasps of relief, her body folding into Daniel's sleeve. "My baby," she wept. Isla's tone softened. "You'll see her soon. Tonight, this ends." Outside, Rowan's curses faded as officers dragged him to a waiting squad car. His voice was nothing now, drowned under snow and chains. Inside the shack, Daniel crouched with Elena, Ranger at their side. The shadow of fear still clung to the walls, but it no longer ruled them. For the first time, survival filled the air. The shack had fallen into silence. The shouts, the snarls, the chaos, all of it bled away the moment Rowan was dragged out into the snow. What remained was the creak of the dying fire and the faint drip of blood, where glass shards littered the floor. Elena slumped against the wall, trembling so hard it seemed her bones had forgotten how to hold her. Her wrists, raw from ropes, rested limply in her lap. Each breath came jagged, catching in her throat as if even breathing hurt. For weeks, maybe months, she had swallowed every cry, every sound of despair. Silence had been survival. But now, with the scarred man gone and no threats echoing from the walls, something inside her broke wide open. Her sobs tore out raw and unstoppable, filling the shack with grief so loud it drowned the fire's crackle. She pressed her palms to her face, trying to contain it, but the sobs burst through anyway. Daniel crouched nearby, saying nothing, his jaw tight, his gaze steady. He knew some wounds couldn't be guided, only witnessed. It was Ranger who moved. The shepherd padded forward, nails clicking softly against warped boards. He sat beside her and lowered his great head to her knee. His breath came slow and even, a rhythm against her fractured sobs. His dark eyes stayed on her, silent, unblinking, demanding nothing. At first, Elena didn't react, but her trembling hand dropped, brushing his fur. The warmth startled her. She clutched fistfuls of his coat as though afraid he might vanish, as though he alone held her to the ground. Ranger stayed still, his steady breathing anchoring her. Her sobs shifted, softer now, but deeper, pouring from a place buried too long. "I thought no one would come," she gasped between tears. "He said no one cared, that no one ever would." Daniel's throat worked, but he didn't rush. He wanted to tell her Sophie had never given up, but he let her words fall free first. Elena leaned into Ranger, pressing her forehead to his head. Her tears dampened his fur, but he didn't flinch. "I told her to run. My baby." Her voice cracked. "I thought I'd never see her again." Daniel heard Sophie's trembling plea in his memory. "Don't let him forget her." He drew a slow breath. "You will see her again," he said softly, his voice rough but steady. "She's alive. She's safe. She's waiting for you." Elena froze, clutching Ranger harder. "Safe. Safe. Sophie saved you." For the first time, her sobs broke into something else. Relief. A broken laugh, almost hysterical, before she collapsed again into tears. But this time, they carried disbelief and release, not despair. Ranger leaned closer, muzzle pressed to her arm, eyes making a vow. "You're not alone anymore." By the door, Isla lowered her pistol. She didn't speak. She knew what it was to let someone break and rebuild without interruption. The shack still smelled of blood and smoke, but beneath it, something fragile had surfaced. Hope. Minutes passed. Elena's sobs eased, her breaths evening out. She lifted swollen eyes to Daniel. "She's really alive?" "Alive, waiting for you." Her body sagged with exhaustion. Then I can breathe again." Ranger huffed softly against her skin, sealing the words. For the first time in years, Elena Miller let herself believe she was free. The hospital room was small, painted in soft yellow dulled by night. Machines hummed in corners, lights blinking steady rhythms. Antiseptic lingered in the air, beneath it the faint smell of cocoa and pine that clung to Daniel's uniform and Ranger's fur. Elena sat upright in the narrow bed, wrists bandaged, lip-stitched, pale but no longer shadowed by fear, a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her swollen eyes kept drifting to the door, waiting. Daniel stood near the window. Ranger sprawled on the tile at the bed's foot, ears flicking at hallway sounds, but gaze steady on Elena. The door creaked open. Sophie appeared, small in an oversized sweater, her sleeves dragging past her fingertips, her hair tangled, her cheeks flushed. She held a paper cup of cocoa, then froze at the sight of her mother. "Mommy?" Elena's breath caught. Her hands flew to her mouth. Tears broke instantly. "Sophie." The little girl dropped the cup. It spilled across the floor, forgotten. She ran barefoot across the tile. Elena opened her arms. The collision was soft but fierce. Sophie threw herself into her mother's chest, arms locking around her waist. Eleanor clutched her so tightly it seemed she feared letting go would make her disappear. Their sobs filled the room. Elena buried her face in Sophie's hair, whispering, "My baby, my baby." "I thought you were gone," Sophie cried. "I thought I left you behind." Elena cupped her daughter's face, tears falling onto her cheeks. "You didn't leave me. You saved me. I told you to run because I knew you'd find help. And you did." The child's lip trembled. "I was so scared." "So was I. But we're together now. That's all that matters." Ranger rose silently, padding closer. Sophie turned and touched his head. "You kept me safe," she whispered. "You found her, didn't you?" Ranger huffed, tail flicking once, as if confirming what she already knew. Daniel turned to the window, throat tight. The fragile reunion pierced deeper than words. He remembered Sophie's plea, "Don't let him forget her." Now, the promise is fulfilled. Elena pulled Sophie onto the bed, wrapping the blanket around both. The girl curled against her, sobs fading into hiccups. Elena stroked her hair, whispering, "You're safe now. No one will ever take you from me again." She looked at Daniel, gratitude shimmering in her gaze. "She never stopped believing in you," he said quietly. Elena kissed Sophie's forehead. "Then she's stronger than I ever knew." The child stirred, voice muffled. "Can we go home now?" Tears returned, but Eleanor's smile broke through. "Yes, sweetheart. We'll go home." Ranger curled once more at the foot of the bed, eyes half open, guarding until certain they would be safe through the night. In that sterile room, hope took root again. The hospital had settled into its midnight rhythm. Hushed voices drifted down the hall, wheels squeaked, then faded. Inside, Eleanor and Sophie slept curled together, mother and daughter bound tight, even in dreams. Eleanor's arm remained curved protectively around her child. At the bed's foot, Ranger stretched like a living shield, eyes half-lidded but scanning the room in quiet intervals. His breathing was slow, steady, anchoring the silence. Daniel sat in the corner, sleeves rolled up, jacket draped over the chair. He watched the fragile stillness before him. Mother, child, shepherd, and for the first time in a long while, his chest eased. Ranger's eyes met his briefly, as if to say, "We guard them, together." Daniel nodded, the vow unspoken. Sophie stirred in her sleep, her hand slipping free of the blanket, dangling toward the edge. Ranger rose silently and curled close. Her small fingers brushed his fur, clutching instinctively. Her breathing steadied at once. Eleanor murmured faintly in her sleep, but her arm never loosened from around Sophie. Together, they lay in a fragile peace that felt almost sacred. Daniel leaned back, exhaustion heavy, but kept his eyes open. He'd seen too much loss in his life. Tonight he wanted to witness survival, and he did. A mother endured. A child believed. A dog never stopped searching. At the bed's foot, Ranger kept his vigil into the long night. Silent, steady, the sentry who asked nothing, who forgot nothing. The snow had thickened again by the time Isla settled into the cramped office at Willow Creek Station. Outside, wind pressed against the windows with a low howl. A single desk lamp cast a cone of yellow over mugshots and military files that smelled of dust and old ink. The rest of the station slept. Daniel had gone to the hospital with Elena and Sophie. Deputies sprawled on cots. But Isla Hartman did not sleep. Threads of truth waited to be pulled. She flipped open Rowan's military discharge file again. Dishonorably discharged. The word leapt from the page. Beneath it, incidents piled up. Drunken assaults, fights with fellow soldiers, a bar brawl overseas that left a man with a broken jaw. Court-martialed, stripped of honors, expelled. Violence wasn't a byproduct, she murmured. It was the pattern. She turned to police reports from 3 counties. Bar fights, restraining orders, withdrawn. Assault charges that vanished when victims grew too afraid to testify. In one case, a woman described being dragged into a car, only to back out after friends of Rowan visited her home. Fear followed him like a shadow. One report stopped her cold. Rowan detained at a truck stop, suspected of facilitating the transport of 2 underage girls, seen with men already flagged by the FBI for trafficking. Charges dropped for insufficient evidence. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just a violent man. This was a man tied to something larger. She dug deeper, names flickering across the FBI database. There it was, Marcus Velez, arrested 3 years earlier for running a trafficking corridor. A known associate of Rowan. They'd even served together overseas. Isla leaned back, pen scratching across her notepad. Rowan wasn't just violent. He'd been useful, a trained enforcer, loyal to nothing but power, the kind of soldier a trafficking network could use to keep victims silent. She thought of Elena's broken whisper in the shack. He said no one would come. Rowan had never acted alone. Men like him thrived in shadows, protected by silence. This wasn't over. Rowan's arrest was only the surface. If she was right, others were still trapped in that dark. A deputy peeked in, bleary-eyed. "Detective? Coffee?" "Just leave the pot," she said. When the door clicked shut, she stacked the files neatly. Tomorrow she would call her FBI contacts, trace every lead. Saving Elena and Sophie was a victory, but Rowan's shadow stretched wider than their story. And if she had to follow it alone, she would. Her eyes flicked to Ranger's empty spot on the floor. She could almost see him there, steady and watchful, urging her forward. The hospital corridor hummed faintly with fluorescent lights. Daniel sat outside Elena and Sophie's room, elbows on his knees, hands clasped white. Ranger lay stretched at his feet, ears twitching to every sound. He should have felt relief. The girl is safe. The mother was freed. Rowan in custody. But what filled him was a hollow ache. He closed his eyes and slipped back years. Back to a hospital room where his wife Claire had lain pale beneath sheets, machines blinking her life away. He had sat just as he sat now, hands clenched, prayers whispering from a heart unused to them. But no shepherd had come then. No one had answered, and he had lost. He told himself he had done everything, but guilt outlived its host. It gnawed still, whispering, "Not enough." Ranger shifted, lifting his head. Daniel met his gaze. "You ever think," he murmured, "we fight so hard out there because we couldn't win the one fight that mattered?" The shepherd blinked, steady as ever. His presence was enough to answer enough. Daniel leaned back, eyes burning. Sophie's trembling words replayed, "Please save my mommy." They had cut through him like nothing else. They echoed the plea he had once made in silence, watching Claire slip away. Then no one came. But this time, he had been the one to answer. Maybe that was why he had charged forward, why he hadn't hesitated. He wasn't just saving Elena for Sophie. He was clawing back a piece of the fight he had lost with Claire. Ranger nudged his boot, grounding him. Daniel let out a rough laugh sob. "You always know, don't you?" The dog pressed his muzzle against his leg, weight steady. Daniel breathed, letting silence settle again. He thought of Elena's sobs breaking into relief, of Sophie curled safe in her mother's arms. Maybe he couldn't rewrite the past, but tonight he had answered a child's plea. That had to mean something. "I couldn't save her," he whispered to Ranger. "But maybe I can save the ones still left." The shepherd blinked slowly, then lowered his head onto Daniel's boot. The ache remained, but it had purpose now. Sophie's plea had not just saved her mother, it had saved Daniel too. By morning, the story had spread. In Willow Creek, news traveled faster than snowmelt. The Gazette's front page read, "Deputy Ward and Canine Ranger rescue local woman from captivity." The photo showed Daniel beside Ranger outside the station. Daniel had avoided the camera, but Ranger had stood tall, his dark eyes cutting straight through the lens. By noon, it was on everyone's lips. At the cafe, women whispered, "That poor Miller girl, and Ward's the one who found her." An old logger muttered, "Reckless. Could have got himself killed." His friend shot back, "Reckless? He saved her. And don't forget the dog." Similar conversations rippled through the post office, the church steps, the grocery line. People shook their heads in disbelief that such darkness had lurked at their mountain's edge. Reporters crowded the station steps, cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. "Deputy Ward, how did you know? Is it true Sophie led you there? Did Ranger attack the suspect?" Daniel gave little. "The child was brave. The dog did his job. That's all that matters." But Ranger needed no words. When the cameras turned, he stood calm, ears erect, chest broad. Children pressed close to the barricades, pointing in awe. "That's the hero dog," one boy cried. That night, the local news broadcast lingered on his image. Caption: "The silent protector of Willow Creek." Not every voice was praise. At the bar on Main Street, men muttered over beers, "Ward's got a death wish. Running into a cabin with a drunk veteran holding a hostage?" Another shrugged. "Maybe, but he pulled it off, and that shepherd's worth 10 deputies. The bartender set down a glass with a firm clink. "Doesn't matter. The woman's alive. The girl's got her mother back. I'll raise a glass to that any day." Back at the hospital, Eleanor and Sophie were shielded from the noise. Their world had narrowed to healing. Quiet voices, shared meals, Ranger at the door. Nurses paused to scratch behind his ears when no one watched. "Good boy," they whispered. "You're the reason she's here." For Daniel, praise meant little, criticism less. But he saw Sophie's eyes light when she overheard someone call Ranger a hero, saw Elena's shoulders ease when strangers whispered gratitude. That, perhaps, was enough. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Daniel walked Ranger down Main Street. Snow crunched underfoot. People waved, some stepping outside to say thank you. An old man laid a trembling hand on Daniel's arm. "You brought light back," he said, before stroking Ranger's head. "And you, boy, you reminded us what loyalty looks like." Ranger stood tall, scanning the street, ready. Doubts about Daniel's recklessness would always linger, but beneath them rose a stronger truth. Rowan had terrorized a woman and child. Sophie had been brave enough to run. Daniel had answered, and Ranger, silent, steadfast, had never forgotten. The Maple County Courthouse was old, its benches polished smooth by decades of trials, portraits of judges lining the paneled walls. On this morning, the space felt smaller, pressed tight with townsfolk eager to see the scarred man answer for his crimes. Snow clung to boots, melting into puddles on the stone floor. A hush of reverence mingled with the buzz of curiosity. Rowan shuffled in, flanked by deputies. Cuffs bound his wrists, the orange uniform hanging loose on his diminished frame. Yet he held his head high, the scar twisting across his face like a badge. His eyes swept the crowd with the same bitter arrogance. As if fear still shielded him, he was wrong. Across the aisle, Elena sat stiff, rope burns still raw on her wrists. Her hair was pulled back, posture rigid, eyes braced against a storm not fully past. Sophie sat beside her, flanked by advocates. Her blue eyes widened at Rowan's entrance, her body folding inward. And then Ranger moved. The shepherd padded across the aisle and settled at Sophie's feet, his body a barrier, his gaze fixed on Rowan. Sophie buried her hand in his fur, gripping as though he anchored the world. The bailiff called for order. The judge's gavel cracked once. Court is now in session for the case of the state versus Jack Rowan. Rowan smirked faintly, but when Elena was called to testify, it faltered. She rose, trembling but resolute, and swore the oath. Her gaze stayed fixed on the judge's desk, not her captor. "He told me no one would come," she whispered, her voice jagged. "That I was his, that my daughter was his too. For weeks I believed him, until Sophie ran." Her eyes flicked to the gallery. Sophie clutched Ranger tighter, the shepherd shifting closer, head against her leg. Elena straightened. "He beat me when I resisted. He tied me, starved me, told me the world had forgotten me. But he was wrong. My daughter didn't forget. She found Deputy Ward. That's why I'm standing here." The prosecutor asked the final question. "Mrs. Miller, can you identify the man who did this to you?" Elena lifted her chin, her eyes finally locking on Rowan. Jack Rowan. For the first time, Rowan shifted. His eyes darted toward Sophie, only to freeze when Ranger's growl rumbled low, guttural. The sound made him flinch before he looked away. The gavel struck. Order. But everyone had seen it. The shepherd had stripped Rowan of his last weapon. Fear. Elena recounted nights of violence and the moment she told Sophie to run. Her voice frayed, but she never broke. When she returned to her seat, Sophie clambered onto her lap. Elena wrapped her close, whispering something only her daughter could hear. Ranger sat watchful at their feet. The next day the defense struck back. Rowan leaned smugly in his chair while his attorney rose, sharp-faced, voice oiled. "Mrs. Miller, you once withdrew charges against Mr. Rowan, didn't you? Perhaps trauma has distorted memory. Perhaps regret colors your story." Eleanor's composure wavered. "I was afraid," she said, voice trembling. The lawyer spread his hands. "Afraid or unstable?" Murmurs rippled. Sophie clenched her fists, blue eyes blazing. Daniel sat rigid in the front row, fists tight, Ranger lifting his head at the tension. The prosecutor rose swiftly. "Your Honor, permission to call Deputy Daniel Ward." Daniel stepped to the stand, swore the oath. Ranger sat at attention below, unyielding. "Deputy Ward, recount the night you found Sophie." Daniel's voice was steady. "My canine partner alerted me near the tree line. I found her barefoot, trembling, clutching a drawing. She said, 'Please, save my mommy.'" The prosecutor lifted the drawing in its evidence sleeve. 3 figures, a woman, a child, and a tall man, scribbled out with an angry black X. Gasps rippled. Rowan stiffened, unsettled. The defense leapt. "Objection! Prejudicial!" But before the judge could respond, a small voice broke through. "It's him." Sophie had risen, clutching Ranger with one hand, pointing with the other at Rowan. Her voice quivered, but carried through the room. "That's him. He hurt my mommy. He made her cry. He made me run." Silence filled the chamber. The judge's gavel hovered, unwilling to break the fragile power. Rowan shifted, his face darkening, but Ranger's growl silenced him again. Daniel leaned forward, his voice rough but steady. "You were brave, Sophie. Braver than most grown men I've known. Because of you, your mom is alive." Sophie's shoulders shook, but she held the drawing high. "I didn't forget her." Eleanor wept openly now. The judge cleared his throat, voice thick. "Objection overruled." The drawing remains as evidence. And everyone knew. A child's courage had just dismantled Rowan's defense. The courtroom was packed for sentencing. Rowan sat rigid, scar taut, defiance brittle. The judge's voice was grave. Jack Rowan, tried by a jury of your peers, guilty of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, aggravated assault. The sentence of this court is 25 years to life. The gavel struck once. Final. Rowan jerked his head up, shouting, "You can't do this! She wanted me. That kid coached." But his words rang hollow. Deputies hauled him upright, curses bouncing off the paneled walls, stripped of power. For the first time, he looked small. Elena sagged, her hands trembling as tears spilled. Relief, raw and long delayed, broke across her face. Sophie clutched her hand, eyes steady. She didn't watch Rowan being dragged away. She looked at Ranger, who hadn't moved once, his eyes fixed until the scarred man was gone. Only then did he exhale softly, as though closing a chapter. Outside, the hallway buzzed with voices. Relief, outrage, gratitude. Cameras flashed, reporters swarmed. But Daniel stood apart, watching Elena kneel to cup Sophie's face. "It's over," she whispered, sobbing and smiling at once. "We're safe." Sophie nodded, but turned to Ranger, who sat level with her shoulders. His eyes met hers, calm, unwavering. The little girl flung her arms around his neck. "He found us. He never forgot." The words tolled through Daniel's chest like a bell. He blinked against the sting in his eyes. Years of guilt and scars cracked under the weight of one truth. Loyalty had saved them. Ranger pressed his muzzle gently into Sophie's shoulder, tail flicking once, slow and certain. Elena wrapped them both into her arms. For a moment, mother, child, shepherd, formed a circle of resilience in the noisy hall. Daniel watched, pride and ache tangled in his chest. This was why he fought, why he kept going, not for headlines, not even for justice, but for moments when hope returned to those who thought it lost forever. As the crowd dispersed, one image remained. Sophie's arms around Ranger, whispering into his fur. He never forgot. And Daniel knew, as surely as the snow still fell steady outside, that those words would carry him into whatever came next. Winter in Willow Creek had begun to soften. The snow still lay deep across the fields, but the edges had lost their bite, the sun settling warmer against the mountains, promising spring beneath the ice. The town had returned to its rhythms, shopkeepers sweeping porches, children crunching paths through half-shoveled sidewalks. But the air carried something lighter now. A shadow had been lifted. Weeks had passed since the verdict. Rowan's name had faded from the Gazette's headlines, replaced with bake sales and weather reports. But his absence was its own headline, felt in the loosened shoulders of townsfolk who no longer glanced over them as they walked home at night. For Eleanor and Sophie, healing came slower, more fragile. The county had arranged a small safe house on the edge of Willow Creek, tucked against a ridge where the forest opened into meadow. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a narrow porch, and a wood stove that popped and hissed through the nights. But it was theirs, and more importantly, it was safe. Daniel stood at the end of the drive, his boots crunching softly in the snow. Ranger bounded ahead, the shepherd's paws kicking up white powder as he tore across the yard toward Sophie, who was already bundled in a red coat too big for her, her hat slipping low over her ears. The child shrieked with laughter as Ranger leapt around her, his tail whipping snow into the air. She scooped up a clumsy handful of the powder and tossed it toward him. It scattered harmlessly against his fur, and he barked once, sharp and playful, before darting in a wide circle around her. Elena stood on the porch, her arms wrapped in a shawl, watching them. Her face was tired still, but softer. The tightness in her eyes replaced with something else, something almost like peace. When she saw Daniel, she raised a hand in quiet greeting. He walked up the path, his breath steaming in the chill, and joined her at the porch. For a moment, they both stood in silence, watching Sophie and Ranger tumble through the snow. The shepherd dropped low, crouching, before lunging toward Sophie, who shrieked again and tumbled backward, landing in a puff of white. Ranger stopped instantly, standing over her, his ears perked as if asking permission. Sophie giggled and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling herself up by his fur. Eleanor exhaled, her voice low. She laughs again. Daniel glanced at her. Kids are resilient, stronger than we give them credit for. Eleanor nodded, her eyes still fixed on her daughter. Stronger than me. He shook his head. No, she had to learn it from somewhere. Her lips trembled, but she didn't look away. I used to believe I was broken, that he'd taken everything from me. But then I see her, running, laughing, and I realize maybe he didn't win after all. Daniel let the words sit in the air. He didn't press, didn't try to shape them into something neater. Healing was never neat. Sophie tumbled toward the porch, cheeks flushed, her hands buried in Ranger's ruff as though he were both sled and shield. She burst up the steps, panting, her voice breathless with joy. "He won't stop chasing me," she laughed. "I think he wants to win." Ranger shook himself free of the snow, sending powder flying. His tongue lolled, his breath puffing out in heavy clouds, but his eyes gleamed bright, alive with play. Daniel crouched, scratching behind the shepherd's ears. "He's been waiting a long time to play again," he said softly. Sophie leaned against Ranger, her small hand patting his side. "He found us. That's why he's happy." Elena's eyes shimmered, her hand pressing against her shawl as though to steady her heart. Daniel met her gaze, and for a long moment neither spoke. The truth sat between them, quiet but undeniable. They had survived. Sophie darted back into the yard, calling for Ranger, who bounded after her again, his deep bark echoing across the trees. Their tracks carved wild patterns into the snow, messy and joyful, proof of life spilling back into a place that had been too quiet for too long. Elena stepped down from the porch, standing beside Daniel, the snow crunching beneath her slippers. Her voice was low, uncertain. "Do you think it ever really ends? The fear?" Daniel's breath clouded the air as he answered. "No, it doesn't end, but it fades. And you learn to live bigger than it." He glanced at her, his eyes steady. "And you've got people now, this town, that little girl, that dog. None of you are alone anymore." Eleanor's throat worked as she swallowed, her eyes lifting to the meadow where Sophie and Ranger danced through the snow. For the first time, the sight didn't bring tears of grief, but of gratitude. The sun slipped lower behind the mountains, casting long shadows across Willow Creek. But in that yard, laughter rose, strong enough to chase the dark away. The yard had quieted as the sun slipped behind the ridge, leaving the snow touched with faint gold. Sophie and Ranger still played in the drifts, but their energy was softer now, their laughter rolling into gentle giggles, their stride slowing into a companionable pace. The shepherd bounded after her once more, then flopped heavily into the snow, his tongue lolling, his chest heaving with the deep breaths of contented exhaustion. Sophie collapsed beside him, her small body sinking into the powder. She pressed her cheek to his side, her mittened hand patting his chest in rhythm with his heartbeat. Ranger huffed once, his eyes closing, as if to tell her that yes, he would stay there as long as she needed. On the porch, Eleanor and Daniel watched in silence. The air smelled of wood smoke drifting from the stovepipe, of pine needles carried down from the ridge. For a long time, neither spoke, both lost in the sight of a child, laughing again, in a yard that had once been too quiet. Elena broke the silence first. Her voice was soft but steady. She hasn't laughed like that in a long time. Not like this. Not without fear in it. Daniel glanced at her, his expression unreadable at first. "Kids deserve laughter," he said simply. Elena turned her gaze back to Sophie, her throat tightening. "You didn't just save us, Daniel. You gave Sophie her childhood back." The words hung in the cold air, raw and certain. She hadn't meant for them to sound so sharp with emotion, but once spoken, there was no pulling them back. Daniel shifted, the weight of her gratitude pressing against the old guilt he carried. His jaw flexed, his eyes dropping to the porch boards. "I only did my job." Elena shook her head. No, her voice was firmer now. Men who only do their jobs don't listen to a child's whisper in the cold and believe it. They don't follow a dog into the woods without backup. They don't risk everything for people they barely know. That wasn't duty, Daniel. That was my choice. Daniel's hands rested against the porch rail, his knuckles whitening slightly. For a long moment, he didn't answer. The silence stretched, filled only by Sophie's distant laughter and Ranger's low huffs. Finally, he exhaled, his voice low, gravelly. "Maybe I needed to save her as much as she needed saving." Eleanor looked at him then, really looked, and saw the shadow in his eyes, the hollow places left by someone else's absence, the quiet grief tucked beneath his steady exterior. She didn't know the story, not fully, but she knew loss when she saw it. And she knew that in some way, Sophie's plea had reached a part of him that was still raw. Her hand brushed the railing, inches from his, not quite touching. Whatever the reason. "I'm grateful." Daniel finally lifted his gaze. Their eyes met in the fading light, and for a moment there was no fear, no courtroom, no shack in the woods, just two people, scarred in different ways, standing in the silence that comes after survival. Sophie's laughter broke the moment. She scrambled up from the snow, running back toward the porch, with Ranger bounding beside her. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair escaping from beneath her hat, her boots caked in ice. "Mommy, Daniel." "Look how fast he runs. He's the fastest in the world." Eleanor laughed, the sound light and unpracticed but real. "I believe you, sweetheart." Ranger reached the steps first, shaking snow in every direction. Sophie tumbled onto the porch after him, throwing her arms around her mother's waist. Elena bent down, kissing her forehead, holding her close. Daniel stepped back, giving them space, but Sophie's small hand caught his sleeve. "You'll stay, won't you?" she asked, her eyes wide. Daniel hesitated, then crouched so they were level. "For a while," he said gently, "but you don't need me as much anymore. You've got your mom back, and you've got Ranger." Sophie smiled, her arms tightening around the shepherd's neck. "But Ranger remembers. He doesn't forget." Daniel's chest tightened at the words. He reached out, ruffling Ranger's ears. "No," he whispered, his voice almost lost in the evening air. "He doesn't." The last of the sunlight slipped behind the ridge, casting the porch in twilight. Elena stood with her daughter in her arms, Daniel beside them, Ranger pressed close. There were no grand declarations, no promises carved into stone, just the quiet bonds formed in survival, in gratitude, in the fragile hope of healing. And sometimes, Daniel thought as he looked at them, that was enough. The mountains of Willow Creek were wrapped in twilight, the last light of day bleeding into shades of violet and deep blue. Snow glistened faintly on the ridges, catching what little glow remained, while the forest below fell into shadow. It was the kind of hour Daniel Ward knew well, the transition between day and night, when silence pressed closer, when the roads seemed lonelier, when the ghosts of memory stirred. His patrol SUV hummed steadily along the winding back road, tires crunching over patches of ice. The heater rattled faintly, pushing warm air against the cold seeping through the doors. On the passenger seat beside him sat Ranger, his massive frame filling the space with quiet certainty. The shepherd's ears twitched, catching every sound that Daniel's human ears missed. The distant cry of an owl, the crack of ice along a creek bed, the subtle rustle of something moving deeper in the pines. His eyes, dark and steady, scanned the horizon beyond the windshield, as if the whole world were his responsibility. Daniel glanced at him, the corner of his mouth tightening in a faint smile. "Always watching," he murmured, "even when the rest of us are tired." Ranger shifted slightly, his gaze never leaving the tree line. His chest rose and fell in slow rhythm, the picture of calm vigilance. Daniel turned back to the road, his thoughts wandering as the miles passed. He thought of Elena's face on the porch, lighter now, no longer shadowed by fear. He thought of Sophie's laughter tumbling across the snow, the way her small hands had clutched Ranger's fur as though it were the only anchor she trusted. He thought of her words, words he knew he would carry long after tonight. He found us. He never forgot. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. There had been a time when he hadn't believed in such things, when loss had eaten so deep into him that hope felt like a cruel trick. Claire's absence still lived inside him like a hollow space that nothing could quite fill. But somehow, in saving a woman and her child, he had found something that had been missing. Proof that even in the darkest corners, life could still fight its way back. The radio crackled softly, dispatch calling in about a stranded motorist along County Road 14. Nothing urgent, nothing dangerous. Daniel picked up the receiver, his voice steady. "Copy that. I'm on my way." He set the radio back, his eyes flicking once more to Ranger. "Another night, another road," he said. The shepherd turned his head, ears flicking as if acknowledging the words. His gaze locked on Daniel for a brief moment, steady, knowing, before returning to the window, watching the forest slide past. Twilight deepened. The sky stretched wide and endless, the first stars breaking through above the ridge. The world outside seemed hushed, caught between nightfall and dawn, but inside the patrol SUV there was no sense of isolation. There was presence, there was a partnership. Daniel exhaled slowly, a knot inside him loosening. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was driving alone. His thoughts formed into words, unspoken but alive in the quiet of the cab. A mother survived, a child believed, and the dog never stopped searching. In that, hope found its way home. He glanced again at Ranger, whose ears twitched at some sound beyond the glass. The shepherd sat tall, eyes unblinking, carrying his vigil into the night. The SUV curved around a bend, headlights slicing through the darkness. Beyond lay the long roads of Willow Creek, the endless watch of men and dogs who carried both scars and loyalty. Daniel drove on, the shepherd at his side, the sentry whose silence meant everything. And in that silence, there was peace. Sometimes the stories we share remind us of something we already know deep in our bones, that the bond between people and dogs is more than companionship. It's love in its purest form. It's loyalty that never wavers. And it's the comfort of knowing someone will stand guard for you even in the darkest hours. German Shepherds especially seem to carry that gift so deeply in their hearts. Quiet protectors who never forget. If you've felt that same kind of connection with a dog in your life, you know it's something worth cherishing and deepening. There are resources out there that can help you understand your dog better, strengthen the bond you already share, and maybe even learn new ways to give back to them what they've always given you: trust. I've been exploring one myself, and if you're curious, you might take a look too. No pressure at all. It's just something that felt worth passing along, the way friends share things that matter. Because at the end of the day, what truly matters is love, loyalty, and those quiet moments side by side with the dogs who never leave our hearts.